I've come to the woods again. I come here to be rejuvenated. I come here to be reset. I come here so that I can connect with God. Everybody's different. Some people look to the wilderness to get alone and be with God. Others find places like a bookstore or a coffee shop as the place where they best connect with God. Others, it might be a place in your house, maybe your bedroom or your study. And still others, it may be going for a walk or waiting till the house is vacated so that you can turn on worship music and sing at the top of your lungs. All of us are different, but all of us have been created to worship God. And this is the place that I feel closest to God. All throughout the woods, there are places like this where there are fallen logs. I sometimes wonder when I walk through this woods, as I meander around fallen logs, what made that log fall? In some cases, I've actually seen evidence of lightning that has struck trees. In other cases, trees seem to fall during those infamous ice storms that we get, where the branches get so weighed down with extra weight that they succumb to gravity. Other times, a tree just gets old or diseased and it topples to the ground. And other times, well, the roots just don't hold. It may be too wet and the tree collapses. I believe that may be the case with this tree, as it's been growing in a low-lying area where water often stands, and now it has died. The amazing thing is that when you think about it, this tree, just like all the trees that are standing around, once used to be a mighty tree, standing like a tall sentinel in this forest. And trees, well, they're so valuable. They provide places for birds to nest and squirrels and raccoons to be able to find homes. They provide shade in the summertime and protection from the cold howling winds in the wintertime. They provide food for countless numbers of wildlife, from deer and black bears all the way down to the tiniest spiders and insects. And all of these things work together in a woods. It's an incredible ecosystem. From my perspective, it's one of the chief arguments that God did in fact create the world. It's so complex and interrelated. But now the tree has fallen. Its life has ended. It's been uprooted, and it's horizontal rather than vertical. I imagine this tree standing tall amongst the rest of the trees, swaying in the breeze, climbed up and down by squirrels and chipmunks, landed upon by birds. But it didn't become a large tree overnight. It took a while. Just like a lot of the little saplings that are growing in the understory of this forest today, this tree used to just be a tiny fledgling tree. I wonder how many times it got nipped by a deer browsing it before it took off and was big enough so that a deer couldn't damage the tree any longer. I wonder if a black bear ever stood up on its hind legs and rubbed its back against this tree. I wonder if a person ever came to this tree, sat at the base of it, and wrote something down in a notebook, or enjoyed the wind going through the branches, or read a good book. It's possible I even stood in this location at the base of this tree and never even realized it before. But the amazing thing about this tree is that though it has died and has fallen to the ground, it hasn't come to the end of providing value and nourishment for this area. This tree has hardly started to decay at all yet, but it will over time. Bacteria and fungi will break down the tree. Bears will come as it starts to decay, and insects occupy it and tear open nests of ants and other critters so that they can eat them. It takes years, but eventually this tree will actually turn into the soil for the next generations of trees to follow. See, the woods always recycles itself. It keeps giving back. And we as people are called to live that way as we have an impact on our children and the next generation, especially as it relates to worship and praise. Last week, we discussed the Shema in Deuteronomy chapter 6 and the importance of parents instilling the faith of the one true God in their children's lives. And we continue on this week in that theme, but I want us to focus specifically on praise and worship. We're going to do that by looking at Psalm 145, the last psalm in the book of Psalms in the Bible that has been attributed to King David. So let's take a look at Psalm 145 together. If you have a Bible, go ahead and open up there. We're going to focus on the first 9 verses in the psalm, although as you'll see, the theme continues on to the very end of this poem or song. A psalm of praise of David. I will exalt you, my God the King. I will praise your name forever and ever. Every day I will praise you and extol your name forever and ever. Great is the Lord and most worthy of praise. His greatness no one can fathom. One generation will commend your works to another. They will tell of your mighty acts. They will speak of the glorious splendor of your majesty, and I will meditate on your wonderful works. They will tell of the power of your awesome works, and I will proclaim your great deeds. They will celebrate your abundant goodness and joyfully sing of your righteousness. The Lord is gracious and compassionate, slow to anger, and rich in love. The Lord is good to all. He has compassion on all he has made. This psalm, Psalm 145, is the only psalm in the book of Psalms out of 150 psalms that in the title uses the word praise. Now, there are a lot of psalms in the Bible, in the Psalter, the book of Psalms, as it was referred to, that are praise psalms. But this is the only one that has the name in the title. And it's attributed to David. He's the one who wrote this psalm. I also find it interesting that this psalm is what they call an alphabet psalm. There are a number of them in the Bible, where each section or each sentence starts with a letter of the alphabet in alphabetical order. And there is a line for each letter in the Hebrew alphabet. There's one that is missing, and that is for the letter Nun in Hebrew, which is the equivalent of our N letter in the English language. Now, there are a couple of theories on why this is missing, and I like this one the best. Just like Amish who hand sew quilts and purposefully make a mistake in the pattern because they understand that they as human beings are not perfect like God. It's quite possible that one line was left out to further proclaim God's perfection and greatness. It could also be that over time, we've lost the original line in the oldest manuscripts. But neither here nor there, whatever the theory, whatever conclusion you come to, the point of A to Z Psalms is that they show the totality, the all-encompassing nature of God. He is complete for us from A to Z. I should also tell you that when it comes to interpreting the Psalms, I think we have to be careful that we don't press them too hard. After all, they are poetry, they're songs. And we don't overanalyze songs or poetry. In part, they're meant to relate and communicate emotions and feelings, and also there's a certain artistry to them. Having said that, though, it's not that we can't examine them to understand what they're trying to communicate and what they mean. So let's just give a cursory view to each of the verses, the first 9 verses of Psalm 145. In verse 1, we see in the opening line that God is referred to as the King. Later, Jesus will be referred to as the King as well. But a king is a ruler. over all. He's the top one in charge. And so immediately at the very beginning, David acknowledges, despite the fact that he is king, that there is a king that is way over and above his ability and talent. He, God the King, is the one that's worthy of praise, not David. You'll notice in the second half of verse 1 and in verse 2 that David talks about honoring, worshiping, and praising God forever and ever. As though forever's not long enough, he adds forever and ever. And yet David realizes that his life is finite. And so there's an allusion here that will become magnified in verse 4 for us. And that is that it's not just David who will worship God, who will praise God. It's the generations that will follow because of what he and the others that came before him have passed along. The language of verse 3 is used numerous times in the Old Testament to refer to the great and mighty acts that God performed to provide for Israel when she was in distress. And so David is speaking wholly for the entire nation of Israel, but he's also at the same time talking about how God has been great in his life as well. You might think back through David's life and the ways in which God protected him from King Saul, the ways that he provided for him when he stood up against Goliath, the abilities that he gave David to solidify the nation of Israel and make it a strong, powerful nation. God has been good. Verse 4 in this passage, in this song, is a pivotal sentence because it shows the connection of us living out our faith and praising God from one generation to the next. Remember what it says. One generation will commend your works to another. They will tell of your mighty acts. See, every single generation is charged with extending the praise and the honor of who God is to the next generation. I was thinking about this concept of the goodness of God, of his worthiness of being praised, a number of weeks ago when I was sitting in a tree not far from this location. And it's what really inspired me to look into Psalm 145. And although that tree was still standing, it too will one day fall down and die. And all of us will pass away. But our children, our grandchildren, our great-great-grandchildren, perhaps 10 generations from now, 100, will be affected by the decisions that we make to show proper praise to God and to worship him with all of our being. We pass that on from generation to generation. And just like this log behind me is slowly starting to break down into soil, it still has value in its death because of what it leaves behind for that which is living. We then see in verses 5 through 7 a sort of call and response, as though David wants us to think about one generation and the response by the next generation. In this case, the old generation is the generation before David, and the new generation is the one that David is a part of. Notice what he says in verse 5. They will speak of the glorious splendor of your majesty. And my response, David says, is I will meditate on your wonderful works. When the Israelites sat around the campfire at night, when they built their houses and gazed at the stars from the roofs of those houses and shared the stories of what God had done so long ago and recently and even that day, wow, they were creating the soil out of which praise and worship to God exists and grows. And when we think of the splendor of God, His majesty, it leads us to meditate on who He is. That is, to read His Word, to consume it, digest it, to let it hit our hearts and our minds so that we continue to praise and worship Him. Verse 6 shows this parallel connection between the old generation and David's generation. That the old generation will talk about God's awesome works, the ways that He's provided in mighty ways, miracles, if you will. And David also will proclaim the great deeds that God has done in his generation. There's this anticipation, though, of what God will do in the future generation as well. We see a continuity in this psalm. Verse 7 doesn't have this they and I in the first and second half of the verse, but it's implied. And what is the old generation doing? They're celebrating God's abundant goodness. And David and the rest joyfully sing about the righteousness of God. That He is, at His core, incorruptible. He is right in every way. His commands are perfect to us. He is God and worthy of praise. David will then conclude this section of the psalm with some of the most powerful lines in any of the psalms in the Psalter. Verses 8 and 9 go like this. The Lord is gracious and compassionate, slow to anger and rich in love. The Lord is good to all. He has compassion on all He has made. We know that God is gracious because He sent His Son Jesus Christ into the world to pay our debt so that we can be right with God. We know that He is slow to anger. In the ancient Near East, when you made a covenant, a contract with somebody, if you violated even one part of the contract, the entire contract or covenant was thrown out. Think about that. Part of the covenant that God made with Israel was not to sin. And His relationship with us is that He can't be around sin. He's a holy God. And yet we violate that relationship, that covenant, that commitment so often, and the Israelites did too. God could have wiped them out at any point, and He could do the same with us, but His mercy shows because He is slow to anger. And why is He slow to anger? Because He's rich in love. He nourishes us with His love. It is the core desire and need of every person to know that they're loved. A lot of people think that that means that they have to feel in love. They need to feel the emotions of love. And there's a time and a place for that. But more importantly than that is the love of commitment. Knowing that you're secure in God. Knowing that your relationships with other people are secure. And that's what David's referring to here. God nourishes us with His love. Up to verse 9, you could make the argument that maybe David's just talking about Israel. But in verse 9, that gets blown out of the water completely. Because here David says that God has compassion on all. In fact, on all things that He has created. You could make the argument that even the created world around us, God has some level of compassion on it. He doesn't destroy His creation. No, He sustains it by sending rain and sunshine upon the earth so that nature can work as God intended it. There are cycles in place, like trees that grow up from tiny little seedlings into monstrous trees. They serve an important purpose all throughout their lives, but they also serve a great purpose when they die, because they are the soil for the next generation. I spent some time over the last couple of weeks reflecting on God's goodness. I want to challenge you today to make a list. Start making a list as a family of things that show God's character, who He is, and why He is worthy of our praise. And then start listing the things that He has done in your lives to show that He cares and loves you, to show that He is gracious and compassionate, slow to anger, and abundant in love. May God be glorified and praised with our very lives. And may it continue, not just all the days that we are living and breathing on earth, but in those who follow after us, because God used us to make a difference. God bless you as you help others see that God is praiseworthy.